Welcome to another special report from Catholic Family News. I'm Brian McCall, the editor-in-chief, and today we are going to be welcoming back to our program Charles Coulombe, who has previously appeared. My colleague Mary Rundis interviewed him previously, but for those who may have forgotten, he was born in New York City, interestingly, the day of the assassination of John F. Kennedy. So I don't think he has any inside information on what happened that day for those interested, since he was just being born. But in any event, he has a master's degree in sacred theology from the International Theological Institute in Austria, where he currently is residing. He has over 20 books and articles and on a wide variety of cultural, historical, political, and religious topics. He lived much of his life before Austria in the Los Angeles area. And I have to say, personally, I first encountered or heard about Charles Coulombe when I first converted to traditionalism. So I'd left the Novus Ordo. We were just a few months in tradition, and someone gave me a set of cassette tapes. Tells you how long ago this was, of some conferences that were held, I think, through Una Voce, California, where Mr. Coulombe was with Mr. Bierzak, was having kind of a discussion, a comparison of the Old and New Mass, and kind of my first introduction to thinking about these differences and digging in and reading and learning after that first experience of seeing a traditional Mass come from those conferences. So he really was instrumental in my first months with tradition, and so I'll always be grateful for what I learned from those lectures. He also has a Monday podcast called Off the Menu. So welcome back to Catholic Family News.
Thanks very much, Brian. Great to be back. I do have one slight correction.
Yes.
I was born the day Kennedy was elected, not the day he was shot.
Okay. The day he was elected.
The day he was shot is probably my first datable memory. And for all you Kennedy assassination fans, I do have a theory.
Okay.
It was a CIA plot to get Governor Connolly. It went terribly wrong.
As many CIA plots do. Well, there you go. You were actually born when he was. So you are a list of suspects, since you were actually alive.
I was alive that day, so who knows?
Who knows? Yes. Well, now that we've cleared that up, we are going to be talking about a new book that's been recently published by TAN on the Empress Zita. And many of our viewers may be familiar with her, many have not, but you've had an interest in this family, the Habsburg family, and particularly the Empress Zita and her husband for a long time. You've previously published a work, biography of her husband, the Emperor Charles, who was the last emperor of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which succeeded the Holy Roman Empire. And it might be important for our viewers to understand how she comes to this role as the last empress, because many Americans, I think, first of all, confuse the concept of monarchy with hereditary primogeniture, and they think they're inseparable. So maybe it's how she comes to this role, and her husband, obviously, as well, in the Holy Roman Emperor, and then the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and well, I guess let's just leave it at that. How does she come to this role?
Well, we'll start with her husband first, because
yes.
Obviously,
yes.
When he was born, I can't think of the year, the early 1880s. When he was born, he was not the heir to the throne. Mm-hmm. The Emperor Franz Joseph, who had come to the throne in 1848, his uncle had been the emperor. His uncle had no children, and wasn't a stupid man, but he wasn't the brightest. And so the family, 1848 was the year of the Great Revolutions all over the empire. Yes. And so the family sort of got together and decided that Ferdinand really was not the man to deal with the problem. So he abdicated, and Franz Joseph's father abdicated his right to the throne. And Franz Joseph, at the age of 19, became emperor. Now, bear in mind, when he becomes emperor, there's revolutions all over the place. And not just in Austria-Hungary either. I mean, it's across Europe. It's a horrible mess. But he was very good at choosing people. He made a few terrible mistakes, Franz Josef did, but on the whole, he was a pretty smart fellow. So he, one way and another, was able to cobble together an end to the revolutions, and then set about trying to steer Austria-Hungary, or Austria as it was then, into the new time, into the new period. Now he came equipped with 4 brothers. The next one was Maximilian, and then Karl Theodor, and then Ludwig something, Ludwig Wilhelm, I forget. Anyway, he doesn't really come into the story, but Karl Victor, the third brother, does, because Maximilian, instead of now, mind you, Franz Josef gets married to Empress Elizabeth, who was sort of the Princess Di of the 19th century.
That's a good analogy.
It really is. He marries her. They have a son and several daughters. So the heir should be Crown Prince Rudolph. The brother, of course, in defective Rudolph dying early or having children, not having children, whatever, the next heir would be Maximilian, and then the next heir, their brother, Karl Theodor or Karl Victor. Anyway, sadly, Maximilian was murdered in Mexico by Benito Juarez. He had been asked ever since the Mexican conservatives were defeated in their civil war in 1857. They kept asking him to become Emperor of Mexico, and he kept refusing because he said there's not much chance of succeeding. Now then, the British, the French, and the Spanish. Well, in 1861, I guess it was, Benito Juarez was bankrupt, having run the country into the ground, and he came up with a novel way of saving money. He wouldn't pay any debts. Now, the problem was he owed a lot of money to the British, the French, and the Spanish. So they said, "We'll tell you what, we'll land, we'll take Veracruz, we'll collect all your customs, we'll pay ourselves. Don't you trouble yourself." Well, Napoleon then once they did this, Napoleon thought the thing to do would be to conquer all of Mexico and redo the government, which he did. And then the conservatives turned around and said, "Will you be emperor?"
Mm.
So he did, but then the American Civil War ended, and the Americans gave Napoleon III an ultimatum to get out of Mexico. He did. They armed Juarez to the teeth. Maximilian was defeated and executed. And interestingly enough, his 2 top generals were given the choice of their lives if they would break their oaths to him, and they
Wow.
refused, executed with him. And to me, that's always seemed an interesting judgment on the man himself. That those closest to him chose to die with him rather than save their skins.
Wow.
Anyhow, so Maximilian's out of the picture. Now we've got Karl Victor, Karl Ludwig. I get confused sometimes. Age is fun, but he in turn had 2 sons, Otto and Franz Ferdinand. So Otto gets married to a Saxon princess. They're very ill matched. She is very devout and very dour. He is very fun-loving, charming, handsome, promiscuous. He'll die of syphilis. So they're
So
not
they're the
very
Henry VIII and the Catherine of Aragon of,
well,
of this time,
except there's no divorce.
except there's
So
no divorce.
no
Exactly.
divorce, no
Yes.
nothing.
Yes.
But when their son Karl is born, you've still got Crown Prince Rudolph,
Mm-hmm.
and if something should happen to him, you've got Franz Ferdinand, the older brother, and then the father Otto, and then Karl. So the idea that Karl would ever be emperor was highly unlikely. But in 1889, in the Kennedy assassination of the 19th century, Meyerling, uh, Crown Prince Rudolph kills himself or is murdered. One or the other. The FBI was not involved. Neither was the CIA. Lee Harvey Oswald was nowhere near Meyerling on that day. They know where it was. He wasn't there.
So Cash Patel declared it a suicide. Got it. Okay.
Yeah. Well, oddly enough, well, that's a whole other tunnel we
Yes.
could go down, which we won't. But suffice to say, so Rudolph's out of the picture, but Franz Ferdinand is still with us.
Yes.
Franz Ferdinand, however, he finally decides to get married, but morganatically. He gets married to a commoner, well, a noble woman, but
Hmm.
well, they get married, and actually, Franz Ferdinand is an important part in the story because the price of his getting married to the woman he loved, to steal a phrase from Edward VIII, was that it was declared morganatic. Their children could never inherit the throne,
Mm.
which meant that now Karl was heir if his father should die.
Mm.
Now, a lesser man than Franz Ferdinand would have hated his nephew
Mm.
because he's taking the place of his own children. But Franz Ferdinand was not a lesser man. He loved his nephew. He gave him the home life that he didn't get at home. He gave him an example of marriage, and that is a really big part of Karl and Zita's story. Because Zita, as you'll hear, came from a very happy home. Karl did not. His exposure to marital happiness was his uncle Franz Ferdinand and his aunt
Mm.
Sophie. Now, they too were very devout. Just like Karl's own mother, Franz Ferdinand was and his wife were both extremely devoted to the Sacred Heart. And that too plays a big part in Karl's formation because his uncle was at once a man of action, a deep thinker, a really domestic, and very devout. And those four things would characterize Karl. So, Franz Ferdinand is murdered, as you know, at Sarajevo, and Karl becomes the heir to the throne. The Serbian secret police were behind the murder. There's no question of that now. And there was a lot of suspicion of it then. Not the Serbian government, not the prime minister. But you've got to bear in mind that the man who ran the secret police and who was responsible for the murder had also overthrown the king and queen of Serbia in 1903.
Mm-hmm.
So he was kind of an independent power in the realm. Also, in November, the Serbian government were facing elections, and they did not want to appear weak in front of the Austrians. So, with the head of the peace party, Franz Ferdinand, dead, the head of the war party, the foreign minister, Count Berchtold, issues the demands to Serbia and was deathly afraid they'd be accepted because they were actually quite reasonable. And if they had been accepted, he'd have been stuck with no casus belli, and he would have had to just okay. I guess we'll send in the police and investigate, which would have been very upsetting. However, unfortunately for everybody, there was a war party as well as a peace party in every European country. And
Mm-hmm.
when I say that, it's important to understand because why was there a war party? The peace party is kind of obvious, I think.
Yeah.
Anybody with half a brain would say that, probably it's better not to be slaughtering each other. The war party were not interested in mass murder. The problem was that in every single European country, you had, for different reasons depending on the country, but with the broad background of the Industrial Revolution, the rise of an urban proletariat, the rise of Marxism, socialism, there was a great deal of division in every European country. And so for the war party, the quick way out of that was a quick war. We'll wave the flag, everybody will be in uniform, we'll be home by Christmas, and national unity will be restored. A little bit like happened for us at 9/11. Although I highly doubt that anyone was looking forward to the forever war that would ensue as a result. And that, of course, is always the problem for a war party. They don't know. All they can see are the problems that a war would solve at home. What they can't see is the damage it will do. That so as a result, um, Serbia calls on Russia, and the irony there is that Russia and Germany in 1905 had come very close to a peace treaty that would have guaranteed Europe's peace for quite a while.
Mm.
Kaiser Wilhelm went on a cruise with his cousin Tsar Nicholas in the Baltic, and they came up with a treaty of alliance and non-aggression, which also obligated. Remember that at the opening of World War One, Europe was divided into two blocks: the Triple Entente, the Triple Alliance. Triple Entente was Britain, France, and Russia. The Triple Alliance were Austria, Hungary, Germany, and Italy. What the 1905 treaty would have done is obligated Germany and Russia, once allied with each other, to bring each other's two remaining allies into a six-party peace pact, an alliance for peace, if you will, to guarantee a lack of war in Europe. Well, they signed this treaty, and the Tsar and the Kaiser happily go back to their respective capitals, and both of their governments refuse to accept it, which shows you that as early as 1905, it wasn't the monarchs that were running those countries; it was the politicians, the representatives of the people. You couple that with the Serbian government's actions, and if you want to focus blame for the war, you could focus it on the political class or on democracy itself if you want. But that's why they stumbled into the war. So now they're at war. 2 years into it, Karl is emperor. His great uncle dies, and now he and his wife are at the summit of a country that is literally fighting for its life. All right, that's Karl. So Zita, she was a Bourbon princess, and the Bourbon, you may recall, the royal houses of France, later Spain, the two Sicilies, that is southern Italy, and the Duchy of Parma in northern Italy. So Zita's father had been the Duke of Parma, which in 1859 was annexed by Sardinia when they were expanding over all of Italy, the so-called Risorgimento. And she and her mother, her father, her father was a boy, had to flee with his mother to Austria, where they moved in with his uncle, who was actually the heir to the French throne, the Comte de Chambord. Well, the Duke of Parma would marry twice and have 12 children by each of his wives. The first wife died. She was another Bourbon. The second wife was a Braganza, Portuguese princess, and she was Zita's mother. So you had a total of 24 children.
Wow.
And quite a few of them had mental and physical issues. So the Duke insisted on his two broods being raised together and looking after each other. And this would have a big effect on Zita. The home life was very happy. Her older brothers and sisters she considered full brothers and sisters. And every year they'd go back and forth between the family's homes in France and Austria. So that was her upbringing. She played with Karl as a little girl. They kind of lost sight of each other. But then they were, in 1910, they were brought together by a mutual relative. And they fell in love. Franz Josef was absolutely overjoyed because she was a Parma, she was marriageable as a royal. Karl was overjoyed because he was in love. And their wedding took place in one of her family's castles here in Austria called Schwarzau, which is today a women's prison. But they got married in the chapel there. I've been to the chapel. It's a couple of times. It's quite lovely. I've not been in any other part of the castle, not being a woman prisoner, at least not yet. But yeah,
Well, if
well,
you start identifying as a woman, you never know the consequences.
who's to say? And I
Yes.
mean, who am I to judge? I don't know. But so at any rate, so Zita marries him, and it's an interesting thing. But his feast day as a blessed is not his death day, which is April 1st.
Oh.
It's the day he was married, October 21st. That is his feast. And so I was there in Rome for the beatification back in 2004. And when they announced what the feast day was, I thought, they're going to open her cause. They're
Mm.
definitely going to open her cause. That's the only way. And one thing that to be borne in mind is that Emperor Karl was beloved of his soldiers because during the first 2 years of the war, he was on every front. They called him Karl the Sudden because he would show up, uh, and he had no trouble being at the front. He performed some really amazing acts of gallantry, including rescuing a soldier who was washed away by a flash flood in Tyrol at his own
Wow.
great risk to his own life. This is what I mean. It was much like Franz Ferdinand, man of action, but very devout, very thoughtful, very domestic. So, anyway, there they were. The great uncle dies, and now they're emperor and empress. Now, what do? Well, he argued against a lot of things his German allies were pushing. And the thing to bear in mind is that they were definitely the senior partners. Also, what's obvious is that the Kaiser, Wilhelm, although he was nominally in charge, was not. The
Mm.
real rulers of Germany were Hindenburg and Ludendorff.
Yes.
And they, even when Karl was able to convince Wilhelm that something should not be done, it didn't matter because he wasn't making the decisions. So you see, democracy had triumphed.
Yes.
The arguments they had were over things like unconditional submarine warfare, shooting, hitting neutral shipping, which Karl said that's going to bring America into the war, and if they come in, we're going to lose.
Mm.
They didn't believe him. Ha ha. He had had poison gas. He said, it's more trouble than it's worth. And, if you do it, we'll be branded forever as criminals.
Mm.
Ha ha. And then the biggest fight he had with them was over what he considered to be a harebrained plot scheme to unleash into Russia, which was, despite the deposition of the Tsar, was still carrying on the war, a revolutionary named Vladimir Lenin.
Mm.
Now, they also had the idea of sending a similar fellow, whose name escapes me, to Italy. Well, Karl was able to put his foot down on that. He said, whatever his name was, is not going to Italy through my country.
Mm.
So that killed that. Lenin was supposed to go to Russia through Galicia, but Karl put his foot down on that. He said, no, not only is it wrong for Russia, if we unleash that thing, it'll cross borders. It'll get all of us.
There you go again. Yes.
But see,
Wow.
of course, he was a young and stupid man,
Yes.
not like his really bright elders who knew what they were
Yes.
doing and were very experienced. So what should happen then is that almost immediately Karl and Zita put themselves to the task of ending the war. Now, to be fair, there were a couple of other figures who've been interested in that. Pope Benedict XV, of course,
Yes.
Victor Emmanuel III, the King of Italy, and the King of the Belgians, King Albert. Now, of course, what Karl had in common with these two other monarchs is that, unlike the prime ministers and cabinet ministers and various other riffraff of that sort, they'd all been at the front.
Yeah, they'd seen it.
Yeah, they'd actually been there, and didn't think it was a nice place. they
Yes.
they had issues, but obviously the representatives of the people knew better from the safety of their various capitals. So inevitably, well, the first thing that Karl did was he opened up a channel to the Allies through his brothers-in-law. Because as it was for so many royal and noble families in Europe, World War One really was a civil war,
Hmm.
and his sister's older brothers went to fight for the Belgians because the French, they had a law that wouldn't accept members of the royal family into the army. So they tried France. The French refused them. They went to Belgium. Um, and the King of the Belgians allowed them to act as intermediaries between Karl and the French and British. Well, didn't work because ultimately the problem was when things were going well for the Central Powers, his German allies weren't interested in peace, though the Allies were. And when the Allies were doing well, they weren't
They were,
interested in peace,
yeah.
though suddenly the Germans were. In other words, both sides were more interested in complete victory than they were in ending the slaughter. And this
Now that
became
doesn't
even.
sound like our day in Eastern Europe right now
Oh
with
no,
Ukraine and
no, no,
Russia. Yeah.
no, 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 nothing like that.
Nothing. No.
And you know, I one hates to sound nasty, but in the end, although the lives of Karl and Zita were tragic, the lives of their subjects were worse. It was
Yes.
their deposition was a far greater blow to their peoples than it was to them.
Yes.
Uh, Now, where did that deposition come from in the end? The good old U.S. of A. Because dear old Woodrow Wilson, the man who brought segregation to the District of Columbia, uh, what? He left
No,
his mark.
I love the little side notes there.
Well, he left his mark. You know, we all
He
do
did.
our part.
We all do our part.
Uh, he accepted a demotion from president of Princeton to president of
Yeah.
the United States.
Yeah.
You know, he kept us out of war, at least with anybody who could fight back. That was his motto in his second campaign.
That's
He
right.
kept us out of war. And the interesting thing, initially, he got us into war with Germany over the so-called Zimmermann telegram, which
Hmm.
purported to be a note from the German Foreign Office to their embassy in Mexico, telling them to tell the Mexican government that if they'd attacked the Southwest, they could keep what they got. You know, the little problem with that is that Mexico was in the middle of a civil war at that moment.
Yes.
They weren't going to be attacking anybody, and I would think that both both the German Foreign Office and their embassy in Mexico would have been aware of that. So there has been some speculation that it was a British forgery.
Mm.
But whether it was or it wasn't, Wilson gets Congress to declare war on Germany. All right, but not Austria. Why? Austria hadn't done anything to us. They weren't
Mm.
involved in the Zimmermann telegram. So what happens? He waits. And then unfortunately for Austria, they have a huge victory on the Italian front at Caporetto. The Italian front collapses. The Austrians are pushing toward Venice, and Wilson wants to rush troops there as soon as possible. But there's a problem. We're
He's
neutral
not
in
at
that
war.
conflict. Yeah, we're not in the war. You know, you can't just rush. It's not like now where a
Where you could just
president can
send
just rush
people anywhere,
troops.
right?
Yeah, you know, then in those days you had to have something called a declaration of war by Congress, you know, to justify that. So, I mean, other than minimal interventions like Tangier in 1904, other other than small scale things, uh, that's one of my personal favorites actually because there, you know, because of the Moroccan situation, the great powers in Europe were on the verge of war, and we come blundering into that. Hey, everybody, we're here. Anyway, so it's always tickled my funny bone. You know, they're all tensed up. The French, the
Yeah.
Germans, the Spanish, the British. one move by any false move could set off the powder keg, and up in we come, stars
Didn't
and
we go?
stripes flying. Hey, everybody, we've come to the party. What are we supposed to do now? Anyway, I digress. So, long and the short of it is that Wilson, after the collapse of the Balkan front, he declared that by this time Austria-Hungary was starving, and he declared that unless the Habsburgs were deposed, the blockade would continue. And that was sort of the straw that broke the camel's back. Now, I won't go into the details. You can read about them in both my books as to the collapse and then the subsequent exile of the imperial family to Switzerland. But what I will say is that noted pro-German, pro-Austrian commentator Winston Churchill declared that if Wilson had not insisted on the deposition of the Habsburgs and Hohenzollerns and Wittelsbachs and so on, as he put it, the Hitlerite monster would never have crawled out of his sewer, and we would not have had that Second World War. And Stalin, as a result, would not have become master of half the continent.
Yes.
But all that did happen thanks to Mr. Wilson, so we have a lot to be grateful to him for. Obviously, when that war was over, Europe was divided between a Soviet and American diarchy of sorts. And there was certainly no room for Habsburg restoration then, since neither of the two owners of Europe would permit it. And we'll see what the future holds. One can only hope it's something better than the past, although the present is a bit. I was in Ukraine in 2022, a few months after the war started, and it still goes on, and it really hit me during COVID, that with maybe the partial exception of Hungary, I don't think there's a single government in the world, major government, that has anybody with a brain running it.
Yeah, it's hard to think of one.
It just, they're all committed to the ruin of humanity. What do you think being committed to abortion is? Being committed to euthanasia, being committed to gay marriage, the end of the species. And I'm not even speaking about religiosity. I'm not even speaking about ethics. If you're in favor of death, you're not in favor of life.
Yeah.
This isn't rocket science. But it seems hard to wrap one's mind around it.
Well, it's true. The commitment to total war that the American administrations have been to on whatever party for decades predates this sort of American hegemony. It really goes back to these times. That just perpetual war. Yes.
It
Yes.
actually, one of the interesting things, we first see unconditional surrender as an American thing in the American Civil War.
Yes.
Where, no, we surrender or forget it.
Yes.
So we get the bloodiest war the country's ever fought, a great victory. Plus, if the European militaries had looked more carefully at our Civil War, they would have seen the roots add 50 years of technology.
Yes.
Of the horrors they'd be going through. Trench warfare. Think of Petersburg. The aerial combat, balloons, submarines, machine guns. All of those things first began in their infancy in our Civil War. Add 50 years of technology and development, and they give you the horror that was World War I.
Yes.
And that. So in World War I, we insisted on unconditional surrender. We tipped the balance. If we'd stayed out of it, my great suspicion is, especially depending on how the Russian situation went, is that the exhausted Europeans would simply have stopped the way
Hmm.
they did in 1815 and said,
Enough is
okay,
enough. Yes.
yeah, we've murdered enough people. Problems, we've had enough problems, and then perhaps we'd have had another 100 years of peace. Of course, now it's 100 years later, so who knows? Who knows what they would have been like by now? But instead, we set up a sort of artificial order that, for it to stay in place, required our staying in Europe.
Hmm.
But the American people wouldn't stand for that. We pull out, and within 20 years it collapses. We get World War II.
Mm.
But here again, we demand unconditional surrender. Think of what it would have been like had we told the Germans and the Japs, get rid of Hitler, get rid of Tojo, and we'll talk.
We're done. Yes.
Think of what would have happened. Both gentlemen would have found themselves dead or en route elsewhere very quickly. But instead, we let the Soviets into Central Europe for 50 years of horror, and we dropped the atom bombs.
Mm.
And, as far as the bombs go, uh, sure, it avoided Operation Olympic, but we should never have been in that position to begin with, of
Mm.
having that choice. And we wouldn't have been if we'd been willing to have a negotiated peace if they got rid of Tojo.
Hmm.
But unfortunately, this drive to remake the world, after in our own image, especially we don't really know what that image is.
Exactly.
You know,
Yes.
I mean, at least when Wilson and FDR were doing it, America was a somewhat more definable place. But Mr. Bush Jr.'s global democratic revolution. What are you trying to reproduce overseas, Mr. Bush? You want to make Iraq like Oklahoma or California?
Yeah. Exactly.
What are you trying to do here?
Yes. Yes.
What is America? What are we reproducing? What's democracy? And of course, democracy was finally shown to us at its finest during COVID. My little joke at that time was when they had us put our masks on, they took theirs off.
Yes. Very true. Very
So
true.
you see, the reason why Carl and Zita are important to us are for actually many reasons. Partly as examples. When he died, they had 7 children. She was pregnant with their 8th. When they got married, the day afterwards, they were vacationing at the big shrine of Maria Tsel, and Carl said to her, said to Zita, now we must begin to help each other get to heaven.
Mm.
When he dies in 1922, he leaves her with 7 children, one en route, penniless, no
Yes.
prospects, and she has to guide the destinies of the family over the next 18 years through Spain and Belgium. And
Mm.
then, when World War II breaks out, because Hitler hates the Habsburgs, they've got to get out of there. And they come to America. Otto advises Roosevelt for a while till he became enamored of Stalin. I mean, till Roosevelt became enamored of Stalin,
It's not Otto.
not
Yes.
Otto. Let me make that really clear.
Yes.
Wow, that Stalin fellow, not so bad as we thought. No, no,
Yeah.
no, no. And then Zita took the younger children to Quebec, where they went to school. The 2 younger boys, when they graduated from Laval, went to join the resistance in Tyrol
Mm.
and fight the Nazis. Then the war ends. Otto and his brothers are expelled from Austria by Karl Renner,
Hmm.
who betrayed his country 3 times. He betrayed his emperor in
Yes.
1918. He sold the country to the Nazis in 1938, and he went to work for Stalin in 1945. So if you had the money, Renner had the time. But he, at any rate, so Zita comes back to Europe in 1950 to look after her mother, who died several years later in Luxembourg, and she ends up moving into a convent in Switzerland, where she spends the rest of her life living an almost nun-like existence.
Mm.
But starting about 1981, I think, or 82, she comes back several times to Austria and is adored.
Mm.
And then when she dies in 1989, they have an imperial state funeral for her, which nobody had seen coming. And the interesting thing is that to take part in that funeral, large groups of people in the parts of the empire behind the Iron Curtain, which is still very much a going concern,
Right.
they broke the law, uniformed themselves, and came to Vienna for the funeral.
Wow.
And so, as I recount in the Zita book, in some ways, this has been seen as the very beginning of the fall of the wall.
Mm. Which is
Uh,
not credited by almost every history I've seen. They
no.
point to other events. Yes.
Well, and there were other factors. It's never just
Certainly.
one. But
Yes.
I I certainly think A, it had something to do with it, and
Mm.
B, if she is indeed in heaven, I have no doubt that her intercession was really prime in the fall of the Soviet bloc.
Mm. Well,
And
with that, maybe staying with her, could you try to synthesize for our viewers? 'Cause again, you mentioned your hope, your thought, self have our cause progress. What was her heroic virtue? How would you describe, synthesized together from the events you recount, who she was as a person, and really what was the nature of the heroic virtue that we can find in her life?
tenacity, tenacity. She stayed the course. Good
Mm,
times or bad, fair weather or foul.
mm,
She never let herself be deflected. Uh, she went to 2 masses a day for most of her adult life,
wow.
after the death of Carl. She she always had her mind on the good of the dynasty, and on the good of the dynasty's peoples. And she was personally a very brave woman. Her husband made 2 attempts to retake Hungary in 1921. She went with him, although she was pregnant, on the second one,
Mm,
and both of them flew for the first time.
wow.
So they brought along a statue of the Sacred Heart that had been with them in all of their various wanderings. Um, she was she was tough as nails. There's no doubt about that, but very, very feminine.
Mm,
Uh, and I've talked to a number of people who knew her. The one of them says to me that on the one hand, he wouldn't be at all surprised if she turns out, in fact, to be a saint. On the other hand, he wouldn't be surprised to find out she ate iron filings for breakfast, uh, because she was tough.
yes.
But if you look at what she went through, she had to be.
Mm,
And when there's an interesting story. The day her husband died in Madeira, they had been dumped out on this little island in the middle of nowhere in the Atlantic. They had no money, which is why Carl died. Really, a lack of proper food and medicine, because they couldn't afford it. They didn't have the dough. So um, she he says to her, now bear in mind he's dying and from time to time delirious, but he says to her, I've spoken to the King of Spain. He's agreed to take care of you and the children as soon as I'm gone. So when I'm buried, contact him and he'll take care of everything. And she was like, how could you possibly have spoken to the King of Spain? She thought he was delirious. Well, he dies. So she literally has nothing else to do. I mean, so in for a penny, in for a pound. Couldn't wait. So she calls the king, and he says, "Yes, absolutely. I'll send a warship to pick you up." Well, the Allies declared that they would not let her and the children leave, unless they renounced their rights to the throne. Uh, Alfonso XIII, the King of Spain, said, "I am sending the Santa Isabella to pick her up, and if you fire on my ship, you're at war with Spain." Now, that might not sound like a big threat, except that in 1922, the British backed down from a bigger threat with the Turks. They were
Mm,
blood wiped by the war, and there was no way that the British population would accept this.
mm,
So the Santa Isabella arrives, picks them up, turns around, goes back to Spain. They take the train from Seville to Madrid, where the king greets them with open arms. Well, she says to him, I really appreciate what you're doing for us, of course, but why? Why did you risk war with Britain? And he said, well, it's very odd, but the day your husband died, I suddenly had this horrible feeling that if I didn't look after you and your children, the same thing would happen to my wife and family.
wow.
And so she told him her story, and they both kind of rolled their eyes at each other. And said, well, so that was that. And then they moved on to the north of Spain. She didn't want to stay in Madrid. She wanted to raise the children in a rural atmosphere. And so they spent the next 7 years in a fishing village in northern Spain. And then, in order to be closer to the center of things, and so that Otto could go to University at Louvain, they moved to Belgium.
Mm,
And they stayed there until 1940 and the beginning of the war.
mm,
Interestingly, when they fled, as they were coming down through Belgium and then collapsing France, they had 3 cars filled with the Zita, the children, and the servants, and anything they could pack. Well, as you can imagine, there were tons of refugee Austrians fleeing the Nazis, and these were generally stateless people without passports or anything. So, as soon as a group of these folks would realize, oh, you see those 3 cars, they're the Habsburgs, they joined the party. By the time they got to the Spanish border, there was something like 250 people with them,
wow.
and the border was sealed. So what do? They couldn't leave them. Well, as it happened, the commander of that section of the border had been the chief of police in the town that they were in northern Spain. So he let them all in, the whole bunch.
Wow. Well, it's interesting. Tenacity is certainly a virtue that politicians of today completely lack, where themselves and anything they claim they believe in is for sale. So that
Well,
is quite the
I,
virtue.
I like I like actually what Zita's grandson Carl said fairly recently. He said that it used to be that politicians looked no further ahead than the next election. Now it's no further ahead than the next press conference.
Yes.
and and the other thing too, as I look at Central Europe, having lived here now for the past 7 or 8 years, um, I still think of Karl's dying words that he was suffering that his peoples might come together again.
Ah, yes.
And that partly gives you hope for the future because I can't imagine that such a sacrifice will be unheard forever.
Mm.
But the other is that it points out what an incredible man he was. Because to be honest with you, considering how little support he got from those peoples when push finally came to shove, I wouldn't have died blessing them and praying for them. Uh, but I guess that's why he's a saint and I'm not. I will
Yes.
say though, I will say that he the story of the 2 of them is one that is still very, very relevant for our time. Uh, Carl was a tremendous image for manhood and masculinity, and Zita for womanhood and femininity.
Yes.
Because, I mean, she was tough, as I say, but she was every inch a woman, every inch a lady. and never a what you would call a women's liver.
Mm.
She
Well,
Go ahead.
no, no, go ahead.
Yeah,
No, I mean, I think that even more for women is something lacking in our day. That the what feminism has done is told women the only way to be strong is to be a man, and as opposed to the virtues exhibited by her, strength in femininity
yeah,
is been completely lost. Yes.
it has been, and she um, she was an amazing woman, and it's been quite a privilege, frankly, these past several years to write first about him and then her, especially because I've gone to so many of the places where they lived and
Mm,
where their story worked out. Uh, it it really on so many levels, it's a story that needs to be known. And what's interesting too is that he has gotten an extraordinary amount of following in the United States, which is funny when you consider that we were the architects of his ruin. But there are 31 shrines in his honor
wow.
across the country, and I have no doubt. I mean, the uh, headquarters, you might say, of Zita's uh, cause in the United States is Clear Creek Abbey in
Mm,
Oklahoma. Now, the reason for this is that she was a Benedictine oblate.
yes.
And so the Diocese of Le Mans in France, where Solesmes, where she was an oblate of, uh, they're the diocese where her cause was introduced through.
Mm.
And so her cause here in Europe has a very heavy Benedictine flavor, and so it does in the States.
Thanks. Wow. Well, we've been talking about this new book published by Tan Books and publishing Tan Books Zita. It's a companion book to the book on her husband, the last emperor, for now, of the Austrian Habsburgs. And this book is available from Tan Books. And the Catholic Family News has an affiliate program with Tan Books, and this link will be in the description. Is in the description. If you click this link and purchase the book through this link, Tan will offer you some discounts, but will also contribute a portion of the proceeds of any book sales to Catholic Family News to support our apostolate. So if you click that and go to the website, you can find again both books if you haven't yet read the first book, but now this second book on Zita, and a reminder again of the podcast Off the Menu, which I think you said is on Mondays. Is that correct?
It comes out on Mondays.
Mondays.
Yeah,
So if you've enjoyed this conversation, I think you would enjoy the book. As evident from our conversation, Charles Coulombe is not only incredibly knowledgeable and has conducted so much research, but is a master storyteller. And so, many times biographies can be difficult reading, even if the subject is good, because they're just very dry and drawn out. But as you can tell, I think from our conversation, this is beautifully told as a story in the classic sense of that. So I highly recommend that you get this for perhaps your summer reading. And thank you again for joining us to have this conversation. We'd love to have you back again another time to continue some of these discussions.
thanks very much. Happy to. I knew John Minari, so I've I've got a long acquaintance with Catholic Family News. So there you go.
Well, thank you, and we look forward to seeing you next time. And God bless our audience, and thank you for your support.
For part 2 of this interview, focusing on monarchy and current events, go over to catholicfamilynews.locals.com. In addition to this part 2 section, you can find the e-edition of our monthly newspaper, over 10 hours of lectures from our Father Fahey conference and other series, the premium section of our weekly news roundup each week, and a monthly Q&A session.